This lesson will cover interest groups and political action committees and focus on Chapter 7. You should already have some familiarity with what an interest group is, but the formal definition is an organization that seeks to achieve goals by influencing government decision-making. What exactly does that mean? It means that the group has a vested interest in policymakers actually implementing and passing policy that is favorable to the interest group. Some examples of interest groups would include Fight for 15, which is an interest group focused on a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. The Christian Coalition, which is very much focused on increasing the freedom of Christian rights. And then Never Again MSD is a special interest group that's focused on gun legislation and gun reform. And then, of course, the Me Too movement. Many people feel that they are part of this movement, and I think most of you are familiar with them. So what are some key functions of interest groups? Well, their main purpose is to educate the public about policy issues. So, for example, when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, typically you can go to their websites and look at what it is that they are standing for, what they push forward, and ideas on where they would like to take policy and what kinds of policies they want legislators to pay attention to. They also provide average citizens with an avenue of access to activism. So whether this be organizing rallies or protests or getting them to sign petitions, these are all examples of how they can get citizens on board with civic engagement and political activism. They can also mobilize citizens and stimulate them to participate in civic and political affairs. So they can start local chapters or encourage others to start chapters in their areas. And then they can also, they can also start grassroots organizations. So this would mean actually getting out into the communities and trying to encourage more people to care about the policies at hand or join those interest groups. There are several key functions to interest groups. The first would be performing electoral functions. So they have a vested interest in people voting a specific way. Some examples of these interest groups include the American Conservative Union or Democracy for America. Other reasons would be to provide information and expertise to policymakers. For example, individuals may understand how policies would specifically affect the public or individual groups. And whereas many of the policymakers may not have that direct experience or knowledge, they can become educated on those things. Special interest groups can also protect the common good. So, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is probably one of the most popular or commonly known, special interest groups can help to ensure that civil liberties are not being violated. They often will provide financial support to individuals in lawsuits that might even get up to the Supreme Court. In addition to that, they can also fund the amicus briefs and submit amicus briefs on behalf of a party that might be engaged in a lawsuit or might have a case that has been taken up by the Supreme Court. So they serve a big purpose, not only in funding, but the reputation that they have, the access to resources that they might be able to provide, all of that. There are many different types of interest groups. Some of the biggest interest groups are actually corporate and business interest groups, which seek policies that benefit a particular company or industry. Some examples would include the Motion Picture Association of America or the National Cannabis Industry Association. Agriculture is also a huge industry in the United States, and they have interest groups that focus on everything from cultivating to selling crops in the U.S. Some examples would include the American Farm Bureau Federation or California Avocado Commission. And then you have your trade and professional interest groups. Most professions have an interest group that supports their views. So for example, you've got the American Nurses Association or the American Society of International Law. And then of course you also have the National Education Association. Some interest groups are public and ideological interest groups. For example, we've got consumer interest groups. These are groups that protect consumer products. Some examples would include Public Citizen or Consumer Action. We have environmental interest groups. These are groups that advocate for the protection of the environment and wildlife. This includes People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and Greenpeace. And then lastly, we also have religious interest groups. These are groups which lobby for laws that support their religious views. For example, PACs Christie, USA, and Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. There are interest groups that also take a particular interest in foreign policy or foreign relations, and they advocate for specific foreign policies that are beneficial to them. Some examples include the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee or the U.S.-China working groups. Now, interest groups have evolved over time. Many of the traditional interest groups are typically made up of members with higher incomes, they're upper to middle class, they happen to have higher education levels, and they also tend to favor elites. Some examples would include country clubs, bowling leagues, or gardening associations. Modern day interest groups, however, are more focused on social issues. They happen to be large, informal groups. They also lack formal membership, may just be people who have a passion about the cause but may not be formally members of any particular group. They also tend to be more so working class. Some examples would include the Me Too movement or the Occupy movement. There are two types of theories you want to be familiar with. The first is pluralist theory. So this is where the government is dependent on a variety of large, diverse people. Power is equally distributed among all people, and they all have equal effect on how the government will respond and what the government will take concern with. How can we see this theory being applied today? Well, first we can look to the American Association of Retired Persons. They have the power, due to its 37 million members who represent a large portion of voters, to sway or influence the way that policymakers take on their concerns or prioritize their issues. The Human Rights Campaign, although not having a particularly large member base, focuses on more specific issues to gather a more cohesive member base. And so the attention that they give to issues tend to garner a lot of support or garner the attention of policymakers. Pluralist theory runs under the idea that there are so many competing interests that it creates an equality or further democracy as to what policymakers are willing to pay attention to. And because of these competing interests, that tends to be more reflective of what is equitable to the people. It also insinuates that the larger number of people who are taking an interest in issues and bringing the attention of legislators to issues will be able to get those issues paid attention to. Elite theory, on the other hand, assumes that those with the most money and education will always hold more political power. Rather than pluralist theory, where we're looking at so many diverse interest groups being able to fairly compete with each other, we actually see under elite theory that only a few interest groups hold the majority of the power and are going to be able to garner the attention of policymakers. Today we can see this carried out in two major interest groups that do tend to garner more support. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce brought in 467 bills to the Congress floor, and the American Hospital Association brought 182 bills to the Congress floor. In your opinion, which of these two theories is more evident today? Now, there are many strategies that interest groups will use to try to push the policies that they're concerned with through. So first off, they may get celebrity experts. These celebrities or charismatic leaders can help persuade policymakers to pay attention or to vote a specific way. Some examples would include the use of Seth Rogen or George Clooney or Hassan Minhaj or Ashton Kutcher, for example. These are all individuals who have come before Congress to make a claim for a policy that they support. Special interest groups also create political action committees or super PACs. These extensions of interest groups are really the money-making base, the part of the interest groups that raise money to influence outcomes of elections. They often will hire lobbyists to go to these congressional committees and pitch their case. And these lobbyists, which again are often hired by these political action committees, on behalf of these special interest groups, act as mediators between the interest groups and politicians. So again, they're much more charismatic, they're much more knowledgeable, they have those connections. They can often kind of wink, wink, say that there will be financial support from these interest groups. But either way, many Congress people would have no idea the impact that policies might have on individual groups or different groups of people in the country, and these lobbyists can bring this to their attention. Issue networks and iron triangles are a little more complicated. Let me try to break this down. An issue network is a group of many different institutions and entities that are all working in the same direction. So for example, you might have politicians who are using their connections to influence other politicians. They may have relationships with a variety of interest groups, other legislators, the media, different bureaucratic agencies. So all of these institutions are working together to push forward issues. An iron triangle can technically be part of an issue network, but it's much more specific to who makes up that iron triangle. So for example, you would have a member of Congress who might serve on a significant committee that would have a much more impact in whether or not a policy or a bill gets pushed forward. In addition to that, there may be a relationship that congressperson has to someone in a head position of a bureaucratic agency. So this would be reflective of the executive branch. In addition to that, you would have a special interest group. So maybe it could be, an influential president or leader of an interest group that's going to garner support from that base of voters. And if all three of these entities are working together, that is going to have a major impact on whether or not the issues get pushed forward. With all of these things in mind, it's also important to bring in the concept of the revolving door. So many politicians often go back and forth between working in the public sector and the private sector and the public sector and the private sector. So when this happens, individuals who may know the ins and outs of politics may then become lobbyists on behalf of private enterprises or private interests. And just imagine all of the backhanded deals that might be made because individuals have already developed those networking relationships. Here you can see a depiction of an iron triangle. Again, the three entities that make up the iron triangle include Congress, or a member of Congress, someone within the bureaucracy, so a bureaucratic agency, and then someone who has power or pull within an interest group. So this could be a president or an influential leader. So how does this all work out? Let's look at Congress. What can Congress be able to offer a bureaucratic agency or the leader of a bureaucratic agency in exchange for their support? Well, they might be able to provide funding or political support in allowing the bureaucracy to carry out their functions. In addition to that, what about the bureaucracy? What do they give to the interest group? Well, they can give and provide, ensure that there are less regulations, maybe some special favors that might be provided to the interest group. What does the interest group have to offer Congress? Electoral support, right? A base of voters, sponsoring that individual, encouraging voters to vote for them. And then within that, policy choices and execution can be had when we're looking at the bureaucracy on behalf of Congress, friendly legislation and oversight when we're looking at Congress on the interest groups, and then congressional support through lobbying is also something that interest groups can be able to offer favorably to the bureaucracies when they are lobbying members of Congress. Focusing on a few things that were covered in the text, we can look at celebrity experts like Seth Rogen, whose mother-in-law suffered from Alzheimer's disease, and he testified in the U.S. Senate subcommittee about the financial and emotional toll Alzheimer's disease takes on families. His celebrity helped to focus attention on the issue. Figure 7.1 shows us the impact that lobbying has on the policies that legislators pay attention to. One of the largest interest groups, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, has significantly increased the number of lobbyists it employs, the amount it spends on lobbying, and its revenue. And lastly, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is an organization that represents several groups that advocate on behalf of Muslim Americans, providing them legal counsel.